All right, in this video, you guys are going to review scientific method and experimental design. So I want you to write this in your notebook. I want you to write down experimental design, and right below it, I want you to write independent variable and dependent variable. When you're designing an experiment, there are two things that are going to change in your experiment. There is going to be the treatment that you're giving the experiment, or the change that you're giving the experiment, and its effects, which is the dependent variable. So I want you to write these two variables down. They're the only things in the experiment that are going to change. That's what variable means, to change. First, we're going to talk about the independent variable. The independent variable is what you are testing. That is the question that you asked. So if you are interested in how the amount of fertilizer affects plant growth, the amount of fertilizer is what you're asking to see if it has an effect. That is what you're testing. The amount of fertilizer is going to be the treatment that you give the plants. And the amount of fertilizer is also what you're changing from group to group. So in that experiment, the amount of fertilizer would be the independent variable. The dependent variable is the outcome of that treatment. It is the data that you collect at the end. It's the effect or the outcome of the treatment or change that you've done. And it's again what you collect at the end. I want you to pause the video and write down these two lists. Okay, now that you've made these lists, underneath the independent variable, you have two groups. You have the experimental group and the control group. Do you know which one does not receive the treatment? Think about the answer in your head. All right, the control group is actually one that does not receive any treatment or any change, whereas the experimental group does receive change or the treatment that you're testing. In fact, you could have multiple experimental groups. For example, when we're testing the amount of fertilizer on plant growth, you can have different groups that receive different amounts of fertilizer. For example, maybe one group receives 5 grams, maybe a second group receives 10 grams, and a third group receives 15 grams of fertilizer. Where the control group would receive 0 grams of fertilizer, because it's the control. Why do you need a control? Well, we need to know that the control group doesn't grow better or worse than the experimental group. We use it as our baseline for comparison. If the fertilizer groups grow better, then we know that it is the fertilizer that did cause those plants to grow better. But that's not just all you have to do in an experiment. Because remember, if you're growing plants, a lot of things have to be the same from group to group, and we call those things constant factors. Constant factors are values in an experiment that remain the same from group to group and keeps the experiment unbiased and controlled. What this means is that within all of your groups of plants, they all receive the same amount of soil, the same amount of sunlight, the same amount of water. These are all considered constant factors because no matter what group you're in, either the experimental group or the control, these are the factors that must remain the same. And that keeps the experiment unbiased and controlled. What that means is that you're only testing to see that the fertilizer is causing changes. So I want you to pause the video until you are done writing down this whole page. Alright, so now let's look at an example experiment. Here's a diagram from a Regents exam from 2007. There are two different setups of this experiment. I want you to look at these two different setups, and I want you to pick out the two different things that are different. There are two things that are different about each of these diagrams. So I want you to pause the video, and I want you to write two things down that are different between picture A and picture B. Alright, do you think they know the two things that changed? Let me show you one of them. One is that this water bath is at 20 degrees Celsius, whereas this water bath is at 35 degrees Celsius. The second thing you should have seen was the amount of gas bubbles in each of them. You have low gas bubbles over here, and you have a lot of gas bubbles over here. Now, the question is, which one is the cause and which one is the effect? The cause would be the independent, and the effect would be the dependent. So I want you to pause this video, and I want you to write down what you think the independent and dependent variables are. Okay, now let's check yourself to see if you're right. The independent variable in this experiment is the temperature, and the dependent is the amount of gas bubbles. Temperature causes a change in the amount of gas. The gas is affected by the level of temperature. You could also make a conclusion off this by saying the warmer the temperature, the more gas bubbles that are made. Alright, so now let's talk about titles. When you're writing an experiment, when we write our labs, we write them in a very specific manner. So we're going to use the experiment that we just saw on the other page. We looked at temperature and we looked at the amount of bubbles. So when you're writing a title, it's the effects of blank on blank. I want you to pause the video and write that down in your notes. Okay, now that you wrote this template down for titles, underneath it I want you to write this. It's the effects of the independent variable on the dependent variable. It's very important to understand. It's the independent variable that does something to the dependent. The dependent variable, its value is dependent on that independent variable. So let me see if you guys can make a title from the experiment before. The effects of blank on blank. So let's go back to that diagram. We have temperature and gas bubbles. So the effect of blank on blank. So I want you to go back and I want you to write down what you think the title is. The effect of blank on blank. What do you think? Alright, so you should have written it down. You should have written down the effects of temperature on the amount of gas bubbles. Sorry for my handwriting. Alright, so check yourself and make sure that you're right. If you wrote the effects of gas bubbles and temperature, that is backwards and wrong. So make sure that you correct it in your notes. Alright, make sure you bring these notes to class tomorrow so we can use them to actually design an experiment.